Welcome to the Afterlife Files, where we investigate near-death experiences, shared death experiences, and how they affect you. Unlike podcasts that are just stories, we will give you a heads up on what to look for in our conversation. And then, after the interview, stick around because we help you make sense of those accounts so that you can incorporate the insights into your life. I think you'll find that once having your most profound questions answered, living life in the physical is filled with more peace and joy. In the middle of our conversation, our guest, Dr. Jeffery Long, is going to summarize the conclusion of his research with these words, and I quote, "Everything I've learned about the afterlife and near-death experiences is profoundly good news for each and every one of us." End quote. Why? Because he believes that his research shows proof positive of life after death, and that afterlife puts us in a state of unity with the divine and each other. The binding agent of that oneness is profound love of the universe, unlike anything that can be experienced here in the physical. He will spend the entire interview justifying why he believes this is true. It takes us the entire interview just to get through all of them, but he explains nine lines of evidence that point to NDEs being real. As we make our way through these 9 examples, keep this in the back of your mind. He thinks that this evidence says that near-death experiencers answer for us our greatest questions, like, is there an afterlife? Is there a God? What is the afterlife like? What's the purpose of earthly life? And finally, are we really eternal beings? There is an especially rich section as we discuss 2 of his interview questions with profound implications. First one, during your NDE, did you encounter any information about mystical unity, oneness, or connection? And the second one, during your NDE, did you encounter any information concerning love? Perk up your ears when you get to that part. Last bit. Here's a heads up. Hurricane Ida ravaged Louisiana last August, and the Longs' home was substantially damaged. They are still living in a temporary trailer 7 months later, so the environment of this filming is humble, as is the speed of his internet. You'll notice at times there are a few glitches. Stick with it, because the information he's presenting is invaluable. Jeffrey is so excited to share his information that he just is bursting to get it out. The speed of his conversation just makes me smile. Lastly, you should know a wonderful thing, that Dr. Long submitted an essay in the 2021 Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies competition for presenting evidence on the survival of human consciousness after bodily death. Dr. Long was in the runner-up category and won a $50,000 prize. This is a prestigious award, and we're lucky to have Dr. Long with us today. Here's our interview. Over the last several years, I've had the distinct pleasure of being a co-MC of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. And as in that position, I've had the chance to introduce Dr. Jeffery Long a bunch of times. And it's really been fun to listen to the presentations of Dr. Long and his wife, Jody, about what they're doing at their amazing organization. So I think you're in for a treat today. So let me read the official bio here. Here we go. Jeffery Long, MD, is a radiation oncology physician living in Houma, Louisiana. Over 20 years ago, he founded the Near Death Experience Research Foundation. So you can find that at nderf.org. Dr. Long has investigated over 3,500 near-death experiences, which is by far the largest number of NDEs ever scientifically studied. Portions of the NDERF website have been posted in over 30 languages, allowing global outreach. Results of his previous research were published in the New York Times best-selling book, Evidence of the Afterlife: The Science of Near-Death Experiences. Millions of people have seen Dr. Long discuss his research on shows including the NBC Today Show, the Dr. Oz Show, National Geographic Television, History Channel, The O'Reilly Factor, and on television broadcasts around the world. Welcome, Jeffrey. We are really glad that you are here today.
I really appreciate that, Scott. We got a lot of interesting stuff to talk about.
Yes, we do. And your foundation, the the Near Death Experience Research Foundation, has played really a unique role in near-death experience research. I know you and Jody have lovingly cultivated this website and your research. So why don't you start us off by telling us, why did you do that? And what does NDERF, what does it cover? What does it do?
Sure. Great question. Scott, over 25 years ago, I was doing my residency training in my medical studies. I'm a radiation oncology doctor, the use of radiation to treat cancer. So all that time ago, I was flipping through a journal, a paper journal, looking for a cancer-related article. Completely by accident, I found an article with the title Near-Death Experience in it. So I paused. I'd never heard that before. And everything I knew as a doctor told me that you're either dead or you're not dead, but what's this like near-death experience? So I read the whole article and was immediately fascinated. I mean, Scott, how can anybody not be fascinated about thinking what happens after death? So reading this was a major cardiologist, Dr. Sabom, who in this article described that in his patients that had cardiac arrest, they described with amazing accuracy ongoing earthly events while they were being resuscitated, which I knew medically was impossible unless they really had, as Dr. Sabom described in his patients, consciousness apart from the body, looking over the frantic efforts to bring them back to life while they were, by all appearances, clinically dead. I was so amazed, I stopped and read some of the bibliographic referenced articles and immediately thought prophetically, why aren't more people doing research in this fascinating area? A couple of years later, I had a college friend visiting me. His wife mentioned that she had severe medical allergies, so bad, in fact, that when she was under anesthesia for an operation, she coded, her heart stopped. And she went on to describe the first near-death experience I ever heard with lots and lots of details. Once again, I was absolutely fascinated and knew that if near-death experiences were real, this certainly changed how I looked at the universe we live in. So a few years later, being a bit of a computer geek, I set up with the very primitive dial-up modems we had in the era and other primitive software support, the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, with the burning question on my mind, are near-death experiences for real? Well, shoot, Scott, it wasn't more than just the first several dozen shared with me on the survey that we had on that website. I wanted to study it with the best scientific methods possible and survey questions. Honestly, I realized absolutely near-death experiences are, in a word, real.
So let's take it back, because you have this tremendous database, and let's kind of start at the beginning for people who are new to this subject. What is a near-death experience?
Sure. While no two near-death experiences are the same, near-death experiences may be defined, conceptualized by a very straightforward approach that I use in my research. You're near death. In other words, you're so physically compromised, you're unconscious or clinically dead with absent heartbeat. So at that time, by the very definition of unconscious, no conscious memory going on, people do have that experience component of the near-death experience. very detailed, what we call characteristic elements, or what occurs during the near-death experience, very consistently observed and often in consistent order.
So when people nearly die, how many have a near-death experience?
It's only around 10% of people that have that close brush with death that have a near-death experience. I actually co-authored a scholarly book chapter where we looked at several decades of prior near-death experience research. Me and my collaborators tried to look over any possible prior research that would give us a clue who will or will not have a near-death experience when they nearly die, and what the content of the near-death experience will be when it does happen. Bottom line is we couldn't find any demographic variable. I mean, you name it, age, gender, education, prior belief system, none of that seemed to correlate with the probability of having a near-death experience when they nearly die, nor what the content of the near-death experience would be.
So it doesn't make any difference how old, where you live, what your culture is, what your religion is, any of that. None of it makes a difference.
You know, Scott, the amazing thing, which still amazes me to this day as a researcher, incredibly, it makes no difference where you are on planet Earth when you have a near-death experience. The content will be strikingly similar. It doesn't make any difference whether you're, say, a Muslim in Egypt, or a Hindu in India, or a Christian in the United States, even an atheist. Wherever on the planet you are, whatever your belief system is, the near-death experience content will be strikingly similar.
So what commonly happens during an NDE?
Well, sure. Again, the characteristics or elements, if you will, of a near-death experience are as follows. Again, very commonly observed and in consistent order. You have that life-threatening event, boom, you're unconscious or clinically dead.
Right.
A common first element is what we call an out-of-body experience. Consciousness typically rises above the body, and from that vantage point, they see and hear ongoing earthly events, often including efforts of others to bring them back to life. They then may pass into or through a tunnel, variably described, but often moving through it at a high speed. At the end of that tunnel, there's very oftenly described an unearthly, mystical, brilliant light. One person said it was like 1,000,000 times 1,000,000 suns, but doesn't hurt the eyes. It's just simply brilliant and beautiful. Once they pass through that tunnel, they may be in an unearthly realm, often described as a heavenly realm. And that's a reasonable description because there may be buildings, but buildings far more beautiful than anything we have that we've known in our earthly life. There may be flowers, plants, and they've often been described as having colors so beautiful that there are no earthly words to describe the colors they are and their beauty. There may be at this time music beyond anything in terms of its beauty that they've ever even conceivably could have heard on earth. They may encounter deceased loved ones. These are joyous reunions. Even if their deceased loved one died of a disfiguring or chronic illness, they essentially always appear as picture perfect health. Deceased pets have been encountered with joyous reunions too in near-death experiences. They may have a life review. They may encounter part or even all of their prior life, showing how rapidly their consciousness is processing during a near-death experience. Typically at this time, they're feeling overwhelming emotions, typically of peace and love are among the most common emotions described. They may then encounter what's called a boundary. They may be with other beings around them. They may come up to what's variably described as a creek, a fence, a chasm. And at that point in time, they have to make a decision about whether to stay in that unearthly realm or return to the earthly life. Remarkably, even though all that they knew in their earthly life, years, typically decades of their prior life, are all that they had prior to that near-death experience, they feel such a strong sense of, as they often put it, their real home is in that unearthly realm. All that peace, misery, discomfort of that event that nearly killed them is gone. So the great majority of people do not want to return to their earthly life. It's only after a discussion that they ultimately choose to return to their earthly life, or in the majority of near-death experiences, they're simply sent back without any further discussion. Then once they recover from that close brush with death, they can share with others in the world their near-death experience.
So that's an interesting thing you said, that they can have a discussion about whether or not they're going to come back. Who do they have the discussion with?
At that point, there's a discussion with other beings. It's not at all unusual for them to encounter. The discussion is usually not among their deceased loved ones, but among other beings. It's very common for people in near-death experiences in this unearthly or heavenly realm to have other beings around them that they often say it seems familiar. They're familiar, but not from their earthly life, and they just can't identify them. But they certainly are very friendly. I want to emphasize when they encounter other beings, they're essentially never judgmental. I mean, these are joyous reunions and very positive interchanges. But with these other beings, or even virtual beings, and sometimes they have religious beings described. But at the time when they have that discussion, again, it's sometimes near-death experiencers will argue, and often quite forcefully, that they do not want to return to that earthly life. They feel home in that unearthly realm of peace, love, beauty that seems so surprisingly familiar to them. They don't want to leave when they have that discussion. And sometimes it just takes a lot of a prolonged discussion with the other beings, often typically described as very profoundly loving, before they do ultimately choose to return to their earthly life.
So a little bit of persuasion there. I love that. The last time I heard you talk at the IONS convention this last summer, you talked about the 9 lines of evidence that was in your book. Can you let's jump into that, because I think that's some really interesting stuff.
Sure. There's a number of different lines of evidence, all converging on the conclusion that near-death experiences and their consistent message of an afterlife are real. Some of the more dramatic of those 9 lines of evidence include near-death experiences in the blind, including those born totally blind. I interviewed Vicky, who was blind from birth, completely blind. To her, vision was unknown and unknowable. And yet Vicky, when she was involved in a bad car wreck, and for those wondering, she wasn't driving. She was actually a professional singer, and that was one of her vocations. So at the age of 22, an inebriated patron tried to drive her home and crashed. The first time she saw her body she was over her body, having a near-death experience. She recognized her body on a gurney only by correlating the sense of feel of her long hair she had at this time and a ring that her father had given her. She correlated that sense of feel with her newfound sense of vision, and went on to describe a stunningly detailed near-death experience, very, very visual. And in fact, when Vicky described her vision, she described what many near-death experiencers do, and that is her vision was 360 degrees. She was immediately visually aware of and processing visual information in front of her, behind her, right, left, up, down. Technically, it's spherical vision. And in fact, when I told Vicky that those of us that have vision in our earthly life have what's called a pie-shaped visual field, you can't see like she could. She literally laughed at me and said, "No, that's not true. Vision, you see things. You see things everywhere. Why would vision be so confined?" And that was an interesting conversation. I now have a small series of people that were either severely visually impaired or legally blind at the time of their near-death experience. In all of those people that had that degree of severe visual impairment when they nearly died, every single one of them described at least normal, and often, as the case of Vicky, supernormal visual awareness during their near-death experience. And that, Scott, is absolutely medically inexplicable. That's just one of the 9 lines of evidence.
So I remember you talking about crystal clear consciousness.
Yeah.
That it's more real than real.
Right.
It fits in with what Vicky was going on.
Oh, absolutely, Scott. And let me tell you that crystal clear conscious, another line of those 9 lines of evidence. To understand how incredible that is, understand that when your heart stops beating, cardiac arrest, heart attack, if you will. Well, of course, immediately when your heart stops beating, blood stops flowing to the brain. 10 to 20 seconds after that event, an EEG or electroencephalogram, which is a measure of brain cortical activity, goes absolutely flat. There's no measurable brain electrical activity at all, and that's been very well documented and studied. It should be measurably impossible for anybody to have any kind of experience during that time, let alone the highly often super lucid near-death experience that occurs that we've documented in literally hundreds of people that had a cardiac arrest and then a near-death experience. So again, that remarkable lucidity, which should be impossible after a cardiac arrest, another major line of evidence for the reality of near-death experience. There should be no possibility of physical brain function producing a near-death experience, and yet again, by the hundreds, that's what they report.
Yeah. So that kind of leads us into another thing that you've talked to me about, and that was this heightened senses that when they're out tooling around in the universe, it's not like the senses we have here in the physical world.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true. We've reported as we mentioned briefly earlier, you may have a life review where you see a portion or, my goodness, even their entire prior life going on during usually the minutes that they're unconscious or clinically dead. That shows the incredible rapid acceleration that the majority, about the significant majority of near-death experiencers report. I've actually asked that in a survey question, and 75% say that their level of consciousness and alertness during their near-death experience, even though they were physically unconscious or clinically dead, was actually greater during the near-death experience than their earthly everyday life. But they do absolutely have supernormal senses. We reported the first case study of an individual born totally deaf, and yet here he was communicating in the near-death experience with a large number of his deceased family members without evidence of sign language, without lip reading. He was communicating, as is typically described in near-death experiences, telepathically. Immediate, instantaneous sharing of information, no possibility of error, and usually that type of communication, in addition to just simply information and concepts, has sort of the entire encompassing concepts around emotions and everything. It's actually, if you will, super telepathic communication. We reported or have reported the first person who was unable to smell things, called anosmia. And yet here during his near-death experience, he was amazed that he actually had an olfactory or ability to smell. But once again, no matter what the your impairment is, or what sensations on earth you may have lost during a near-death experience, you're whole, restored, and generally exhibit supernormal sensory awareness.
Yeah, you mentioned the life review.
Mm-hmm.
How accurate is the playback on that life review?
That's a great question, Scott. And when I wrote it up, I called it perfect playback, because that's basically what it is. It's about, maybe 20-25% of people have that life review where during their near-death experience, they're unconscious or clinically dead, and yet they're aware of events in their prior life. Either part of their prior life or often their entire prior life is playing back. It's often described most commonly as like screens on a wall, so they can see different aspects of their life, obviously moving very quickly, while they're fully aware of that. In the study that I did, I looked at people that went back to try to confirm or invalidate what they saw during their near-death experience life review. These are typically things that happened like early life when they were toddlers, and they may see some very interesting, remarkable things. But every single one of these people who tried to verify what they saw in their life review that they'd forgotten in their earthly life, every time they went back to try to verify it, they found that what they saw was absolutely real, really did happen in their prior life, even if it was long forgotten in their earthly life. So this seems to be a very real recollection of memories that otherwise would have been impossible to access. And Scott, even more amazingly, we have some periodic, what we call panoramic life reviews, where they not only see all the events of their prior life, but they become aware of what the person they were interacting with was thinking and feeling simultaneously while they were interacting with them. And it's often very surprising and very different from what they would have even guessed, even if they'd been aware of that. So again, all part of that supernormal consciousness, acceleration of consciousness, totally beyond anything that we could possibly experience in our earthly life.
So if we have the ability to be the other person, I mean, we're reviewing our life just as us, and we're reviewing it at the same time as the other person. I imagine that would, well, it would be a humbling experience for me anyway.
Yeah, Scott joined the club. We've all done things we ain't proud of. And so literally the very first talk I gave after my book came out all those years ago about near-death experience to a public group, I got to the life review, and all of a sudden everybody started looking, well, humbled and concerned. And I sat there, okay, it's my first time giving this talk. What am I doing wrong? Am I not clear? So, all the rest of the talk went great. And I went, sheesh. But it was only after the talk was done and people lined up and started asking me questions. There they went. They said, Dr. Long, I've done some things in my life I'm not proud of. What if I have an awful life review? So immediately I went, no. During the life review, there's often other beings around, but essentially never is there any external judgment. You simply see your prior life, you understand it. If there's any judging at all to be done, it's the person having the near-death experience that does the judging and not anybody else. So that greatly reassured the crowd I was talking to. And I've given that caveat of non-judgment with life reviews ever since, and much less worried crowds when I bring that forward. But it's true. I mean, there's, and not only in the life review, but in other parts of the near-death experience, essentially never is there that kind of external judgment that people might be so afraid of. A life review, Scott, can actually be one of the most informative, life-changing, and very positively life-changing events that occurs during a near-death experience, because people vividly can understand how their actions affect other people for good or for ill.
So the idea that we could be the other person, and that we can see how those actions influenced other people, boy, that's a real sense of interconnectedness that we as a human species have this ability to be connected with those other people in our lives.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to take that concept, Scott, and run with it. Yeah,
I've been
fascinated. I've been fascinated about exactly what you just said there. So my most recent version of the survey of people that have near-death experiences asked very straight up, during your near-death experience, did you encounter any information about a mystical unity, oneness, or connection? That's the paraphrase of the question, looking exactly at that. And Scott, to my amazement, about 55% of near-death experiencers answered yes, given the choice of yes, uncertain, or no. In the narrative responses that expanded on their response, I was just blown away as a researcher at the amazing unearthly descriptions of, yes, there is that unity, that oneness. We're all one. We're all connected. We're all part of that whole. Times literally hundreds of narrative responses, there was overwhelmingly consistency that is a part of the greater reality. And may I add, Scott, that's not conventional teaching in most Western churches. I mean, they tend to emphasize a separation of humankind from everything else. And here by the hundreds, near-death experiencers describe that there's a connection, a unity, a oneness of all of us and everything. And certainly that's, not only is that not typical religious teaching, but that is certainly not anything you're going to pick up generally walking around living your earthly life. You're not aware of that during your earthly life. We seem to be separate from everyone, but no, not when you have a near-death experience. Remarkably consistently, they describe that unity or oneness that we all have, that we're just simply not aware of as we live our earthly life.
I would think that knowledge of oneness would really change you when you came back.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can just imagine it from the perspective of someone who has a near-death experience. They live their illusion as, like, frankly, I have until I started my near-death experience research. And I think nearly everybody has. I mean, we in humankind, we're an island. We're separate from other people. We don't know what they're thinking. We don't know, we don't feel any kind of, we may have some love or feel close emotionally, but we don't have that gripping sense of connection, unity. And may I add, when they responded to that question, they were far more likely to use the more powerful term unity and oneness than the weaker term connection. I mean, that's really what they're trying to convey, is that strong sense of oneness, unity of all. And that was a surprise to me, how many near-death experiencers describe that, and how overwhelmingly consistently it's described in their narrative responses. And may I add, as a scientist, I know full well what is real is consistently observed. And that is absolutely consistently observed in response to that connection. There does seem to be in the afterlife that oneness and unity of everything that's overwhelmingly consistently observed. It's real.
So the people that have a life review, in that first speech of yours, they were concerned about being judged, and you told them that no, we aren't being judged.
Yeah.
That the only person that is doing the judging is the person who's going through the experience. And you also mentioned that there's usually some sort of light being that accompanies them, when they have this. It's been described to me as that this being loves them through the experience. Is that consistent with what you found?
Thank you. That is absolutely critical to say. On the unearthly, if you will, heavenly realms, one of the most predominant things they talk about is that profound sense of love. They feel, I mean, we all at some times in our life have had love or have a sense of that, but I can assure you, when you have it in a near-death experience, it's off the scale. It's unearthly. It is everything, all your love for who you are, all you are, everything you are through and through. Far beyond, unconditionally, far beyond anything that you could possibly know on earth. In fact, intrigued about love and near-death experiences, I asked a survey question most recently in our most recent survey version, that being, during your experience, did you encounter any information regarding love? Again, over half of the near-death experiencers answered yes. And their narrative responses, again, times hundreds. This was a survey of 834 near-death experiencers, majority answering yes and giving a narrative response. Overwhelming discussion, vividly describing that love, dramatic, complete, unearthly, wonderful, unexpected. Words just seem to fall out of their typewriters as they type out their answers to this survey question. Unquestionably, that's a major part of the greater part of reality, the greater part of what's going to go on in that afterlife. Thank goodness. Hey, Scott, if we're all connected and unified in the afterlife, thank goodness love is a critical part of that too. I'd hate to have it be anything less than that. But again, it's part of the significant evidence for the reality of near-death experience, overwhelmingly, consistently describing unearthly love. And I'd emphasize they didn't learn about during their earthly life from any religious teachings or beliefs they may have had. I mean, this was over and over described as just, simply off the scale of anything that they could have understood, been aware of, or have experienced during their earthly life.
Yeah, boy, does it make a difference experiencing it versus reading about it in a book or having a religious teacher tell you that it exists. That visceral sense of the love being the foundation of the universe. Wow, what a
Isn't that awesome? Oh, I agree, Scott. I mean, it's just absolutely awesome. Just as I could not describe vision to Vicky, who was born totally blind, I can read their words times hundreds and hundreds of narratives, and I get that very powerful sense. But again, I think, and even often they say words fail me. Words are not adequate. So I think we'll all have to be in that afterlife before we can vividly understand from our own personal experience just how profound that love is. And that's good news. That's
that is great.
Everything I've learned about the afterlife and near-death experiences is profoundly good news for each and every one of us.
Speaking of love, you mentioned at the beginning of this talk that when we enter into the light, very often there's a reunion with family and friends and loved ones. Um, what did you learn about that particular event?
Sure. Now, that's a line of evidence, by the way, yet another for the reality of near-death experiences. Now, Scott, when you have basically any altered consciousness that is not a near-death experience, a dream, hallucination, you name it, if that happens, if you're going to encounter other beings, it's going to be, say, the bank teller you did business with that day, the family member you said goodbye to before you went up the stairs to fall asleep. So that's the norm for non-near-death experiences. However, in near-death experiences, both my own study and another study by Dr. Kelly found that 96% of the beings encountered in near-death experience are deceased at the time of the near-death experience. And in fact, they may be deceased without the near-death experience or even knowing it. They may encounter them, and only when they recover from what nearly killed them, they may ask around and find out, yes, that person died before your near-death experience. It's just that you and no one around you knew it. Remarkably, too, we have a small series of people who, in their near-death experience, will encounter deceased siblings, brothers or sisters, who died and they were never told about it. These are typically childhood near-death experiences, younger children. And you can understand this, Scott. I mean, parents often don't want to tell a young child that they had a brother or sister who died often before they were even born. They want to wait until they're older and can understand death better before they share that tragic family history news, age 10 or 12 or something. And yet here are these people, this series of people encountering brothers or sisters that they never knew they had. And may I add, if it's a brother or sister, male, female, the gender is 100% accurate. And they communicate, and then when they tell their shocked parents what they encountered during their near-death experiences, parents are forced to admit, yes, you had that brother, you had that sister, they died, we were going to wait until you were older to tell you. So yet another example, remarkable line of evidence for the reality of near-death experiences, encountering people that died that they didn't even know had died at the time of their near-death experience.
Yeah. So speaking of children, how are children's near-death experiencers different or the same as adult near-death experiencers?
Sure. Now, with especially very young children, there may be, some sort of, they're more often to have another being with them, for example. They may have things explained. There's a couple different ways it can go. That they may be a little bit more simple language in what's communicated to them, but at other times, even as a young child, they seem to have the cognitive, emotional, basically all the mental faculties of an adult. And so they just go on and get communication at a level that would be impossible for them to understand in their earthly life, and yet they do completely and without error in their near-death experience. So the bottom line is, I looked at the elements or characteristics of what happens in a near-death experience, like what we discussed earlier, tunnel, light, unearthly realms, etc., life review. And to my amazement, in the group that I studied, age 5 and younger, their average age was 3.5 years old. And shoot, Scott, these are practically kids so young that culturally they're a blank slate. They almost certainly don't have well-formed religious or social beliefs. They almost certainly haven't heard about a near-death experience. And yet, to my amazement, the content of their near-death experience is absolutely the same among the elements as with older children and adults. So it's amazing. Once again, near-death experiences doesn't seem to matter. Even at that very tender young age, culturally a blank slate, the content, again, strikingly similar, regardless of your age at the time of your near-death experience.
Yeah. So you mentioned that people who have near-death experiences have a whole series of after effects that when they come back, they are changed. And talk a little bit more about some of the after effects that you've seen that really have impacted people.
Sure. Yeah, as you can imagine, having a near-death experience is generally a profound life-changing event. The typical changes observed after a near-death experience are called after effects. These have been well described in both prospective and retrospective near-death experience studies. Among the more common ones are, well, what you would expect. Obviously, there's a decreased fear of death. And that is something you'd expect because, from the perspective of someone who had a near-death experience, they know what lies beyond death doors because they are confident that they personally experienced it. And they know it's nothing to fear. They know there's a wonderful afterlife. So, obviously, a dramatic reduction in the fear of death. Going along with that, a greatly increased belief in life after death. Once again, no surprise. From their perspective, they know what lies beyond death's door. They lived it, so that almost dramatically increased belief in the reality of an afterlife from those that actually experienced it. In addition to that, they're much more likely to be loving and compassionate. They may leave unloving relationships or jobs where they have to manifest unloving values and seek out loving relationships or loving jobs. It's not unusual that they may seek out a new career in the healing fields, medical fields, just so that they can manifest those new realities. They have an increased belief in spiritual interest. They may spend more time in meditation and prayer than they did before. They tend to be more confident and optimistic. I mean, they faced what for nearly all of us would be the ultimate life challenge of nearly dying, and yet they came back, they survived, and learned a great deal in the process. So those are some of they become less materialistic too. They realize the almighty buck is not the main meaning and purpose of our life, the existence, but it has a lot more to do with love of fellow human beings, love of money.
So, does that mean that NDEs are a proof of life after death?
Well, I've asked myself that question now literally for the over 20 years that I've been studying. And I don't take the conclusion that near-death experiences are proof of life after death lightly. As a scientist, I firmly believe that it's evidence, but there comes a point where the evidence is so overwhelming, where there are so many lines of evidence all converging on the reality that there's life after death, and where there's no alternative explanation of anything we've talked about that occurs during a near-death experience that makes sense. I think we've reached that point where I can say near-death experiences, in my opinion, again, based on literally a mountain of evidence, are proof positive of life after death and something about that we can know about life after death as well.
So the NDEs themselves, they believe that this was all real, that what had happened to them.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And not only do they believe it, there's a minority that don't. But especially if you look at those that had the most detailed near-death experiences, they in the study I did, a large group of them, 100% of them believed that there's definitely life after death. So yes, the near-death experiencers as a group greatly increased their belief in life after death, and especially those with the more detailed near-death experiences. I studied a group of 46 of those. 100% of them say yes, there's definitely life after death.
And I believe you said that the vast majority believe that it's a benevolent afterlife.
Absolutely. When we talk about life after death, it's nothing to be feared. For each and every person who goes through their life on Earth, and is not a Hitler or something, you can look forward to a blissful, wonderful afterlife. You will be reunited with other people in those unearthly realms that share your values, that share that love, and that we're all near-death experiences over and over talk about the fact that we're not limited, finite beings like you would believe in earthly life, but we're really here in our earthly existence experiencing only the tiniest slice of our eternal existence. So again, every shred of information that we so overwhelmingly consistently see in near-death experiences is profoundly good news about not only an afterlife, but a wonderful afterlife for all of us.
So when they come back, they come back with insights, with having some of the greatest questions of humankind answered. or is this just fun?
Uh, no, I mean, as you can tell from what we've talked about, they really do have, and that's exactly how I've given talks about this. You look at what are the humankind's, I think, most important questions. Is there an afterlife? Is there a God, or if you will, an ultimate creative consciousness? Is there, what's that afterlife like? Is there meaning and purpose to our earthly life? Are we really eternal beings? These are profound and important questions that probably throughout all of human history people have wondered about. That's what's so exciting about near-death experiences, is to get with overwhelming consistency information regarding all of those questions, and all of it being very, very positive about life after death.
So if you're a seeker and you're not wanting to give yourself physical trauma, because that's always a bad plan.
Correct.
And you're going, boy, I'd really like to have a near-death or near-death-like experience. Are there ways that people have found to recreate that or do something like that?
There's, to the best of my knowledge, and we asked a question about that of near-death experiencers. Has anything in your life reproduced any part of your experience? And without getting into a lot of detail, the answer is pretty much no, with the exception of having another second near-death experience.
Well, yeah, that would do it.
Yeah, that would do it too. But again, you don't want to absolutely, and near-death experiencers understand this. You never want to put yourself in a life-threatening situation to induce a near-death experience. That is, near-death experiencers uniformly recognize that is an absolute wrong move. But what I would suggest, if you want to sort of get the flavor, the sense of a near-death experience, you go to the nderf.org website and you go under experiences and you drop down that tab until you find exceptional experiences. This is what we call our exceptional archive of near-death experiences. These are the most detailed, remarkable ones, and they're also the most informative. I challenge anybody that wants to walk down the path to some significant way of understanding what near-death experiencers themselves personally experience. Read 10, 20, 30, ideally, of the near-death experiences in that exceptional archive, and you will see vividly and in a very real sense, feel through the words of other people, I'm confident, both intellectually and I think to a degree emotionally, what the near-death experiencers themselves feel. They are often very creative in how they express what happened to them. And I think in reading the near-death experience accounts, I think those that are interested and go down that path can take, well, a little piece of heaven from those near-death experiencers home to themselves personally.
Yep. A couple of weeks ago, I had the pleasure of interviewing William Peters, who just came out with his book on shared death experiences. And I think the one hope would be that those people who've had near-death experience are more sensitive and can have shared death experiences, and that that there's some training that people can do to get to open themselves up to shared death experiences. So it's, but it's not about the drugs or inducing it, chemically or something else.
Right, and I think that's a real good point. And I absolutely, that's right, Scott. You could, if you are closed-minded to the possibility of a near-death experience or any kind of shared death experience, well, heck, that certainly is going to help anything. And even if you have a remarkable spiritual experience, you're going to tend to poo-poo it if you're that closed-minded about it. So I think just the very concept that a near-death experience is an equal opportunity experience. It could happen to anyone, young, old, male, female. It doesn't make any difference what their prior belief is. So it wouldn't be a bad idea to always keep open-minded about that. Be aware that these experiences are real, learn about them, and be aware, hopefully no one will have a near-death experience, but statistically speaking, some will. But there's many, many other experiences that are also spiritually enlightening and can be very similar to near-death experiences, including that same, if you were understanding. And certainly people have had that during meditation. A few describe it during dreams even. There's spontaneous out-of-body experiences and a whole host of other things. So
Yep.
be aware, and many people have had that sort of mystical, inexplicable event in their life. The more you learn about near-death experiences, the more a lot of people say, hey, that's analogous to what I experienced, and wow, that's wild. That really was what I experienced, a portal in my life to a greater understanding a greater reality.
Yeah. I'm going to have to spend some more time in that section on your website that talks about exceptional experiences.
Mhm.
But having done this work for 25 years, is there a story or two that just really made an impact on you?
Wow, there's every near-death experience, even after over 3,500, is still valuable, informative, and inspirational to me. So it's really kind of hard to pick and choose. If you go to the Exceptional Archive, I mean, you'll just see so many of these that it's just simply mind-boggling. One that I could pick out of literally hundreds that I could talk about as being remarkable, interesting. There was a Sandy T who had one of the most remarkable detailed near-death experiences shared in recent years. I asked her a whole series of questions. It's all on the website, SANDIT, and you can share in some of her remarkable wisdom just as a microcosm of this dramatic near-death experience. It's not unusual for people to have their consciousness during their out-of-body experience above the earth, and they can see the earth, they can see the stars. Sometimes they take a trip through the universe, and we'll describe the passing of stars. And again, typically there's a spiritual being with them. But Sandy remarkably had very direct and detailed observations of life on other planets in our
Oh,
universe. And the very first one she described dramatically was a world in which there was no land. It only existed in water. So there were beings of intelligence that were in water, many different types of beings in her vivid description you could read, and encountered that. And then there was another trip to other realms that had land. And again, radically unearthly in every sense of the word, alien life described on planets within our physical universe. So those are rare when people actually have that and describe them in detail. But Sandy's is the most detailed I've ever encountered, and that's a microcosm of the insight, the wonder, the kind of things where you read and say, "Wow, I get it. That really makes sense to continue diligently looking for life on other worlds. It appears that it's there, even if we haven't quite communicated with it or discovered what planets have that life."
yeah. So a story that really touched you about um, who you are and where you are and what's your place in the universe.
Oh, that's there's so many of them and they're so consistent. I wouldn't want to diminish any of it. I guess, shoot, Scott, it was sort of that first several dozen that I encountered. I mean, here I was setting up a whole website. I took a week of my time off as a doctor. Interestingly, I was practicing in Las Vegas. So shoot, Scott, I could have done a lot of other things. Bring up a dang website in a week there. There's entertainment there. But that's what I was so interested to answer that burning question: are near death experiences for real? So immediately, right off the bat, I saw that overwhelming, consistent pattern that we've talked about. That pattern of people, clear consciousness apart from the body, absolutely medically inexplicable, bringing in those insights, that wisdom that is just absolutely blows away anything that you could have learned or processed on your earthly life. So I think my hat's off to those first dozen or so, couple dozen near-death experiences, who somehow found me. I was ranked like number 64 on Yahoo, which was the dominant search engine over 20 years ago. And somehow they found me, somehow they shared that experience, and that was the foundation, that encouragement that allowed me to continue that research and share so many experiences with the world.
So here's a little kudo for you.
Mhm.
Um, and for all of you that are watching this podcast, the nderf.org website is really wonderful. It's easy to move around. It's easy to find stories. There's a ton of resources on it. I'll give Jeff here a second at the end of the interview to do a little commercial, but that's my commercial. It's well worth spending some time just knocking around in there and seeing what you can find. Okay, I'm going to go at this one more time. Did you ever hear a story when you got done, you went, "Holy smokes, are you kidding me? We can do that?" I mean, it was just so unusual, and it was so outside of what you thought was possible. You just sat back in your chair and went, "Whoa."
Yeah. Scott, I've done that like scores, probably hundreds of times. I've never failed to be amazed. I think with some of the near-death experiences, okay, just a good example, just very recently, we had a lady who was like about 15 or so years old, riding a horse, fell off the horse, hit her head badly, boom, unconscious, coma actually. And yet her consciousness separated from her, above her body, saw her body on the ground, and then went like a mile away and was able to observe ongoing earthly events at that. A mile away is far outside of any possible physical sensory awareness, and yet was able to confirm later that what she saw, even vastly far from her physical body, was absolutely down to the finest details real. This was also yet another one where during her near-death experience, she had another horse who had died, and she felt some guilt about that, wondered if she was responsible for that horse's death. And as we've had many, many times shared with our website, Encountering Deceased Pets, deceased beloved pets, this horse was there, which had died, and was able to communicate with her in a way she would understand, which is unusual, but it was dramatically reassuring to her. No, you weren't responsible for my death. And they literally had a conversation, both her and that beloved horse, during her near-death experience.
Yeah. Okay, switching gears just a little bit. It sounds like the basics of near-death experiences have really been nailed down, which begs the question then, what's next? Where's the next area of fuzziness that, at least in your mind, needs investigating?
Sure. That's a great question. What's the future of near-death experience research? And certainly one thing we need are prospective studies, but that is extremely difficult to get approval, certainly in America, with healthcare organizations, of having targets placed to check out of body observations, to involve the already overworked medical staff into some additional duty to try to validate what near-death experiences and validate how life-threatening event. So prospective studies are going to be very, very difficult. So I think we can continue to learn, continuing to fine tune what we know about retrospective looking at these near-death experiences. We're just now exploring it in depth what goes on in terms of, if you will, the spiritual content, like what we discussed, that concept of unity, love, that connection of all, the reality of an afterlife, what that afterlife would be like. So I think that's, if you will, one of the next great frontiers. I mean, shoot, Scott, we've had over 3,500 near-death experiences. We have 9 lines of evidence for the reality. If we get 8 or 10,000 more near-death experiences, that isn't going to change that. We're going to continue to see that. So I think we've really nailed down for what any reasonable person would accept as a valid near-death experience as being real, and exactly as near-death experiencers do. I think another thing we need to do going forward is to, there's over like 20 different skeptical explanations of near-death experience. And the reason there's so many is that no one or several of those explanations make any sense at all, even to the skeptics as a group. I mean, think about it. If the skeptics had one or several explanations of near-death experience that seemed to make sense, you wouldn't need over 20. And yet other explanations keep popping up every year or two. So I think as near-death experience researchers, we need to do a better job of looking over all 20 of those and writing a very detailed rebuttal and making sure it's in public domain so that anybody curious can take a look at that. Fortunately, right, Scott, that won't be hard to refute the skeptics at all.
So we did just need a little definition here for those that aren't familiar with the term prospective study. Define that for it, will you?
Yeah, so it means studies in terms of near-death experience. It means you're trying to identify people that had a life-threatening event, typically a cardiac arrest is most common, and you want to get to them as soon as they recover. I mean, they're often in a coma for hours, and they're medically unstable. You want to get them all over that. So in the days to hopefully within weeks, hopefully less than a month or two after that cardiac arrest, you need to approach them, see if they had a near-death experience, find out some details about that, and as part of the prospective study, you can, if they saw any ongoing earthly events, which about 40-45% of the people describe, you can, it's refresh enough in everybody's memory that you can get a pretty good idea how accurate what they saw is. So that's a prospective study. And then you can follow that group of people that had a near-death experience over years and ask similar research questions. The largest prospective study asked it again 7 years after the near-death experience. So that helps us to learn about how they're thinking about the near-death experience, how it's changed their life, after effects develop even over many years.
That'd be really valuable information.
Mm-hmm. Sure would be. Mm-hmm.
So, okay, it's what I heard you say was that kind of the what happens part has been solidified. Mm-hmm. And now we're looking at how do people make meaning out mm-hmm. of this experience. Elaborate a little more on that.
Sure. It's we're into studying, I think, what's called, if you first have to get what I've got and other near-death experiencers absolutely understand. Near-death experiences are absolutely real, along with their consistent message of an afterlife. So then you start to look and say, okay, well, if that is so consistent, what can we learn about that? What are those messages that are important not only to the near-death experiencer, but have relevance to all of us that live our earthly lives? And that's where it gets more and more interesting as we start to fine tune what we've learned about that. We've already talked about the importance of love during a near-death experience. We've talked about that unity or oneness. Well, that's tough to grasp if you've lived your earthly life and it seems impossible. And yet here you have hundreds and hundreds of near-death experiencers describing it. I think we need some longitudinal studies of that and probably some in-depth discussion with near-death experiencers that have experienced that to help characterize that and understand that a little bit better. And certainly, as far as meaning and purpose of earthly life, I asked that as a survey question. Bottom line, near-death experiencers almost uniformly understand our earthly lives are way meaningful and significant, even if they're difficult, which they are. And yet it's important that we be here. There's important lessons for us to learn. We certainly have a lot more that we could learn in response to that survey question for near-death experiencers' perspective about why we're here, what's going on in earthly life, why is it so important?
Woo.
That was a mouthful.
We are bumping up against our time limit here, so I promised that I would give you a chance to talk a little bit about NDERF and your website and the kinds of things that people can find there and on your other website. So go for it.
Sure. We keep talking about NDERF, which is the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, established over 20 years ago. That's the website with over 3,500 near-death experiences posted. You go to nderf.org, and that's the website. You'll notice we have nothing for sale, and we don't solicit donations on that website. It's a public service. Me, and hats off to wife Jody, who's the webmaster, we take that role very seriously. What was shared to us freely, we share with the world freely. We have two other websites that also have some interesting experiences. ADCRF.org stands for the After Death Communication Research Foundation. Those are spontaneous after-death communications. And that's again, a very dramatic discussion of what people have described of talking about encounters with deceased loved ones spontaneously, in other words, not sought after or induced. And then the Out-of-Body Experience Research Foundation, OBERF, is basically everything is not a near-death experience or after-death communication. Those are your spontaneous out-of-body experiences, deathbed visions, prayer, meditation experiences, etc. And we have a whole variety of types of, with different types of experiences that we post there. A fascinating reading on any of those websites. If any of that sounds interesting to you, just check it out.
That sounds like a great way to end this interview. Dr. Jeffery Long, this has been a terrific hour of exchanging ideas. I have loved it. Thank you for being with us this afternoon.
It's been a real pleasure, Scott. Great interview. I've loved every minute of it.
Wow, wasn't that great? There's so much information. Oh, Jeffrey made some points that I think we can summarize and expand upon. Just to be clear, these are my viewpoints. But that's why you watch the Afterlife Files, to gain perspective by using more than one lens with which to view this rich information. I thought it was helpful that Dr. Long established his criteria for what is real. Quote, "What is consistently observed is real," end quote. It's also instructive to note what conclusions 3,500 NDEs point to, and that nothing would substantially change if he had 10,000 data points. Combine his with the very similar findings from the other researchers in the field with large studies, and the evidence is now overwhelming. The data Dr. Long talked about were identified as lines of evidence. Let me summarize these for you because you might have gotten lost in the conversation. 1. Crystal clear consciousness. 2. Realistic out-of-body experiences. 3. Heightened senses. 4. Consciousness during anesthesia. 5. Perfect playback during the life review. 6. Family reunions. 7. Children's experiences. 8. Worldwide consistency. And number 9. Long-lasting after effects. One thing he just brushed over that I think deserves a little more attention, and that is the universe of duality, the one we live here in the physical, is just a small subset of the larger unity universe. And I believe that you can choose which set of rules, the rules of duality or the rules of unity, by which to live your life. More on this in another interview. Lastly, I think Dr. Long is right on. I can see a shift in the research away from are NDEs real to how do we make meaning from the near-death and shared-death experiences. We need to wrestle with the implications of difficult concepts like universal love and oneness. So, on that note, may your day be filled with oneness and love. If you're watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, and comment. You can find the Afterlife Files on all podcast streaming apps: Apple, Google, Spotify, Audible, the lot. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, or pay us a visit at neardeathmeditations.com. neardeathmeditations.com. Bye now. See you next time, and thank you for joining us.